It all happened in an instant. He was standing in the park, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, lost in his thoughts, when she walked up to him. She had a cold look in her eyes, one that wasn't there before. There was a chill in her voice as she spoke, but it wasn't the words that struck him, it was the suddenness. "I'm done," she said. "I can't do this anymore." He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Was this a joke? He looked at her face, searching for some sign that she was playing around. But there was nothing. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and affection, were now distant. It was as if the person he had loved so deeply was no longer standing in front of him. "Wait, what?" he asked, his voice shaking. His heart raced, but his mind couldn't catch up. "You can't just—" "No," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "I can. I've been pretending for too long. I don't need you anymore." It was like a punch to the gut. He tried to steady himself, but the ground beneath him felt unsteady, as if the very earth was shifting. She was leaving. And not just leaving, but rejecting him entirely, as if all the years of being together meant nothing. He couldn't believe it. He wanted to say something. Anything. But words failed him. His mind spun in circles, searching for something to explain what had just happened. How did it get to this point? What had gone wrong? But instead, the only thing he could feel was the coldness of her words, like a heavy weight pressing on his chest. She turned to walk away, her back to him, her footsteps echoing in the silence. It was over. No more long nights together, no more dreams shared, no more love. Just an empty space where everything once felt real. He stood there for a moment, frozen. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. He had been giving her everything, everything he had, and yet, in the blink of an eye, she had tossed it all aside. Why? What had he missed? He thought they were happy. He thought he was doing everything right. He had built a life for them, a future they had planned together. And now it was gone, like dust in the wind. But the real blow didn't come immediately. It didn't hit him right away. It was later, when he sat in the quiet of his apartment, the empty space around him feeling too big, too silent. The reality sank in slowly. The person he thought he knew had just walked out of his life without a second thought. It was over. And he didn't know where to go from here. The woman who had once claimed to love him was now a stranger. His mind was a blur of confusion and hurt, and yet, beneath all of that, there was something else. Something more. Something darker. Regret. Regret for not seeing the signs earlier. Regret for being so caught up in his own dreams that he had failed to notice the cracks in their relationship. He wasn't just heartbroken, he was furious at himself for not seeing it sooner. But as the hours passed, something strange started to happen. The anger faded, and in its place, a quiet realization began to form. The story wasn't over yet. There was more to this than what he could see right now. He didn't know what it was, but one thing was clear, this wasn't the end for him. No matter how much she had hurt him, he wasn't going to stay stuck in this place of regret. He would figure out what had happened. He would learn from this. And the journey to that understanding would change everything. The days that followed felt like an endless blur. He went through the motions of his daily life, but it all felt distant, like he was watching someone else live his life. He woke up in the morning, went to work, sat through meetings, but nothing seemed to matter anymore. The world felt muted, like the colors had been drained from everything. There were moments when he thought he saw a glimmer of normalcy, when he laughed with a coworker or shared a joke with a friend, but those moments never lasted long. Everywhere he went, her absence was a shadow that clung to him, creeping into the corners of his mind. It wasn't just the empty seat at the dinner table or the quiet apartment, it was the memory of everything that had once been. The way she would smile when she saw him, the sound of her voice when she laughed, the way she would gently touch his arm when they walked together. All of that was gone. And in its place, there was a hollow ache, a space that nothing seemed to fill. He tried to push through it. He knew he had to keep moving forward. He had no choice. Life didn't stop just because his heart had been shattered. But how could he move forward when it felt like the ground beneath him had been ripped away? How could he keep going when everything he thought he knew had suddenly turned upside down? He started questioning everything. What was he doing wrong? What had he missed? They had been together for so long, and yet, in the end, she had walked away so easily, like nothing they had shared mattered at all. Had he been blind to the signs? Had she always been pretending? Or had something changed inside her, something he couldn't see? The more he thought about it, the more he began to wonder if he had been too focused on building a life around her, on making everything perfect for her, that he had neglected to look at himself. Maybe he had been so caught up in making her happy that he had forgotten to ask if he was happy too. Maybe it wasn't just her that was to blame. Maybe it was him, too. He spent hours replaying their conversations in his mind, trying to understand where things had gone wrong. Every word, every gesture, every little thing seemed to take on new meaning now. But no matter how much he analyzed it, the answers were never clear. The truth remained elusive, hiding just beyond his reach. At times, the anger flared up again, sharp and painful. He was angry at her, angry at himself, angry at the world for letting this happen. Why had she done this? What had she seen in him that made her walk away without a second thought? He felt betrayed, abandoned, and at times, it was almost too much to bear. But then, there were other moments, quiet moments, when the anger would subside and leave only a quiet sadness behind. In those moments, he realized that maybe the anger wasn't helping him. Maybe it was time to let go of the rage and start looking at the situation for what it was. Maybe it wasn't just about what had happened to him, it was about who he was becoming because of it. So, he started to reflect. Slowly, he began to look inward. He thought about what he truly wanted in life, what he needed to change. He had always been so focused on external things, on success, on wealth, on proving his worth, that he hadn't taken the time to consider what he really wanted, deep down. What was his true purpose? What was the core of who he was, beyond the things he thought defined him? It wasn't an easy journey. There were days when he felt completely lost, unsure of what direction to take. But each day, he grew a little stronger. Each day, he learned a little more about himself, about the things that really mattered. The pain was still there, but it was starting to transform into something different, something he couldn't quite define, but something that felt like the beginning of change. And through all of this, a new realization began to take shape. Maybe this was not just the end of a relationship, but the beginning of something greater. Maybe this was the chance he had been waiting for all along, not to find love again, but to find himself. As the days passed, he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let this define him. He would move forward, not just because he had to, but because he wanted to. He wanted to grow, to learn, to become the person he was meant to be. And that was just the beginning. The weeks passed, and with each day, he felt as if he were slowly piecing himself back together. The intense feelings of betrayal and anger hadn't completely faded, but they were no longer consuming him. He was beginning to see things with more clarity, though it was still hard to escape the haunting memories of her leaving. But something had shifted within him. He started taking long walks in the evenings, trying to sort through the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. The park where she had left him now seemed to hold a different kind of meaning. It wasn't just a place of hurt anymore. It was a place of quiet contemplation. As he walked through the park, he allowed himself to think about the things that had led to this moment, not just what she had done, but what he had done too. It was on one of these walks that it finally hit him. He had been so focused on making her happy, on winning her over with his success, his achievements, that he had lost sight of something far more important. He had forgotten to look inward, to check if he was truly content with who he was and what he had. All his focus on the external had left him blind to the deeper aspects of his life, his happiness, and even his personal growth. He had always believed that he needed to prove his worth through material things, through status, through the things that others could see. He thought that love would follow if he could provide her with the best of everything. He worked harder, longer hours, bought her gifts, and made sure to always be the perfect partner in every way he could think of. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the things that really mattered, his own self-worth, his own happiness, and most importantly, his emotional needs. The realization was like a cold splash of water to the face. He had been so focused on giving her what she wanted that he had never stopped to ask himself what he truly needed. What was he really looking for in a relationship? What was the core of his own happiness? He had been trying to fill the emptiness inside him with things that weren't meant to fill it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something else too. He had allowed himself to believe that his value was tied to what he could give or offer to others. He had based his self-worth on external validation, thinking that if others saw him as successful and worthy, he would feel good about himself. But all it did was create a hollow version of himself, someone who was always seeking approval but never quite feeling fulfilled. It wasn't just her leaving that had caused his downfall. It was the way he had built his entire life around the wrong things. He had let his identity become tangled in what he owned, what he did, and how others perceived him. He had lost touch with who he was at his core. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he needed to rebuild himself, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. He needed to learn how to be content with who he was, how to define his own worth without relying on others to do it for him. This wasn't just about finding someone else to love, it was about learning to love himself first. As he stood by the park, reflecting on all of this, he felt a strange sense of peace. The hurt was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He understood now that this journey wasn't just about healing from a broken relationship, it was about discovering a new version of himself, one that was stronger, more self-assured, and more aware of his own needs. He wasn't sure yet how things would play out, or what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, he felt as if he was on the right path. The journey was far from over, but he knew one thing for sure, he would no longer allow himself to lose sight of who he was. And that was the first step toward finding real happiness. The days continued to pass, and with each one, the boyfriend found himself feeling more and more at peace with the changes that were unfolding inside him. The pain hadn't disappeared completely, but it was no longer the overwhelming force it once was. He had started to rebuild himself from the inside, learning to trust his own worth, regardless of what others thought of him. He was starting to understand that he didn't need to rely on anyone's approval to feel good about himself. But even as he found clarity, the world around him didn't stop. There were still moments when the past crept in, memories of her laughter, her touch, the plans they had made. There were still moments when he missed her, when he longed for the connection they once had. The wound was healing, but it wasn't fully closed. It was on one of those quiet afternoons when he received a message. At first, he didn't even recognize the name. It had been months since he'd heard from her. He had told himself that he was done with that chapter of his life. But curiosity got the best of him. He opened the message. "I made a mistake," it read. He stared at the screen for a moment, the words lingering in front of him like a shadow. He had prepared himself for this moment. He had told himself that if she ever reached out again, he would be strong enough to ignore it. He had moved on. Or so he thought. But as he read her words, something inside him stirred. Was this the closure he had been waiting for? Was this the answer he needed? The message went on. "I know I hurt you. I didn't see what I had until it was too late. I thought I wanted something else, something bigger. But now I see that it was never about what I had with you. It was about something inside me, a fear that I was trying to outrun. I'm sorry." He felt a knot tighten in his chest. She was apologizing. After all this time, after everything that had happened, she was saying she was sorry. And yet, as he read her words, part of him felt a strange sense of emptiness. He had been hoping for this moment, for an apology, for an explanation. But now that it was here, it didn't feel the way he had imagined. He sat down, staring at the screen for what felt like an eternity. The emotions inside him were a whirlwind: relief, confusion, anger, and even a sense of sympathy. He had wanted her to regret leaving him, wanted her to see the mistake she had made. But now that she was reaching out, he wasn't sure what to feel. He wondered, did she truly understand the depth of the hurt she had caused? Did she realize how much he had changed in the time since their breakup? And what did this message mean for him? Was he supposed to forgive her, let go of the pain, and move forward? Or was it just another attempt to keep him tethered to the past? For the first time in months, he found himself thinking about her again, not in anger, but in a kind of disbelief. He had been through so much in the time since they had parted ways, and yet, her message was a reminder of the life they once shared. But now, he was a different person. He had learned so much about himself, about who he was and what he truly wanted. And as he sat there, contemplating her words, he realized something important. It wasn't just about whether or not he should forgive her. It was about whether or not he could go back to the life he once knew, to the person he had been before all of this. He wasn't sure he could. The truth was, the version of himself that had been with her was no longer who he was. He had changed. And that change felt permanent. The person he was now couldn't just slip back into the old patterns, the old routines. He wasn't the same person who had been afraid of standing alone, afraid of being without someone. He had learned to be whole, to be enough on his own. And so, as he sat there, reading her message over and over again, he realized that what he had once hoped for, her apology, her regret, wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was what he had learned along the way, how he had grown, and how he was ready to take control of his own life again. With a heavy sigh, he closed his phone. There was nothing left to say. Days turned into weeks, and he didn't hear from her again. At first, he felt relieved, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He had made the decision to leave the past behind, to move on, and he was sticking to it. But then, just when he thought he had fully closed that chapter, she appeared. It happened unexpectedly, just as he was finishing his grocery shopping. He turned around, and there she was, standing at the end of the aisle. She hadn't changed much. Her hair was the same, her clothes were the same, but there was something different about her. She wasn't the same woman who had walked out of his life months ago. This woman, standing there, was vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them seemed to stretch out, like time itself had paused. He couldn't speak. His heart was racing, and his thoughts were a jumble. She looked the same, but everything between them had changed. She was the one who had left, and he was the one who had been left behind. He had spent months rebuilding himself, learning to stand on his own 2 feet, and now she was standing in front of him again. He wasn't sure what to feel. Finally, she broke the silence. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice soft, almost tentative. There was no anger in her tone, no defensiveness. Just a quiet sadness, like she was carrying the weight of the past on her shoulders. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. He didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to walk away, to continue his life without looking back. He had come so far, and he didn't want to slip back into old patterns. But another part of him, the part that had once loved her deeply, wanted to know what had changed, why she had come back. "I didn't expect to see you either," he replied, his voice quieter than he intended. The words hung in the air between them, as if they were both trying to figure out where they stood. She glanced down at her hands, almost nervously, before looking back up at him. I know I hurt you. I've thought about this a lot. I made a huge mistake. I should never have left you. But I was scared. I thought I needed something else, something more, and I was so focused on that. I didn't even realize what I was throwing away." His heart clenched at her words. He had heard her apology before, but hearing it in person was different. The sincerity in her eyes was undeniable, but the pain of the past was still there, lingering between them. He had come so far in his journey to heal, and yet, in this moment, everything seemed so complicated. "I don't know if you understand what you've done," he said, his voice tight, his emotions bubbling to the surface. "I don't know if you understand how much it hurt when you left. I thought I was giving everything to you, and in the end, it wasn't enough." She nodded slowly, her eyes full of regret. "I know. I know. And I can't take that back. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we had." The words she spoke hit him harder than he expected. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the vulnerability in her posture. It was clear she wasn't the same person who had walked out on him. But even so, the pain of the past remained. He couldn't forget how easily she had walked away, how quickly she had turned her back on everything they had built together. "I've changed too," he said after a long pause. "I'm not the same person I was when we were together. I've learned a lot about myself, about what I need, and about what I can live without." She looked at him, as if waiting for him to say more. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the hope in her eyes, but he wasn't sure if he could give her the answer she was looking for. "I don't know what you want from me," he continued, his voice firm but calm. "I don't know if I can just pick up where we left off. You hurt me, and it's not something I can forget, no matter how much I want to." She took a step closer, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't expect everything to be the way it was. I want a chance to prove that I've changed, that I can be the person you deserve." He stared at her, conflicted. A part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to give her a second chance, but another part of him knew he couldn't just go back to the way things were. He had worked so hard to get to this point, to find peace, and he wasn't sure he was ready to risk it all over again. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their shared history and the uncertainty of what came next. The decision wasn't easy, but he knew he couldn't make it now, not in this moment. "I need time," he said, his voice softer now. "I need time to think about this. To figure out what I really want." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered, and with that, she turned and walked away. As she disappeared from view, he stood there, unsure of what the future held. He had a choice to make. And this time, it was a decision that would shape the rest of his life. The encounter with her lingered in his mind for days, like a ghost that wouldn't leave him alone. He couldn't escape the image of her standing there, vulnerable and apologetic, begging for a second chance. Her words echoed in his head, and no matter how much he tried to push them aside, they kept coming back. He couldn't deny the feelings that stirred inside him. There had been a time when he would have done anything to have her back. The thought of rekindling their relationship, of repairing the damage, had been something he had fantasized about during the long months of pain and solitude. But now, in the face of reality, it was different. He had changed. He wasn't the same person who had desperately clung to her love, who had put her needs above his own. It was this realization that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts. He had worked so hard to rebuild his life, to understand himself, to find a sense of peace and independence. Could he go back to a life with her, knowing that he had outgrown the person he had been when they were together? Was it worth the risk? The more he thought about it, the more he understood something crucial: he couldn't make this decision based on his emotions alone. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about growth, self-respect, and understanding his own worth. He needed to be honest with himself. Would he be happy going back to someone who had once walked away from him so easily? Was he ready to face the same hurt again, or had he learned enough to know that he deserved more than just an apology? The questions seemed endless, and yet, the answer remained clear. He had already come so far. The progress he had made in understanding himself, in learning to live without relying on someone else for his happiness, was far too valuable to throw away. Yes, there was love between them, but love alone wasn't enough. He needed more than that now. He needed a partnership built on mutual respect, growth, and understanding, not just on the fear of being alone or the comfort of familiarity. The choice wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He couldn't allow his past to dictate his future. If he went back to her, it would mean ignoring everything he had learned, all the ways he had grown, and all the lessons he had learned about his own strength. In the end, the decision was simple: he had to move forward, even if that meant doing so alone. He took a deep breath, picked up his phone, and wrote a message. It was brief, but to the point. "I appreciate your apology. I've done a lot of thinking, and I've realized that I'm not the same person I was. I've changed, and I can't go back to who I was before. I need to keep moving forward." It wasn't easy to send that message. The words felt like a weight in his chest, and for a moment, he questioned if he was making the right choice. But deep down, he knew he was. This wasn't about being stubborn or holding on to bitterness. It was about protecting the growth he had worked so hard to achieve. He was no longer the person who needed someone else to complete him. He had learned to stand on his own. He hit send and sat back, waiting for her response. But as the minutes passed, he felt a strange sense of peace. The decision had been made. And no matter what happened next, he knew it was the right one. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. He didn't need to know what came next. What mattered now was that he was finally free, free to keep growing, free to keep learning, and free to live a life that was his own. After sending the message, a strange calm washed over him. It wasn't the relief he had expected, nor the joy of closure, but rather a deep sense of certainty. He had made the right decision. The weeks that followed were quiet, but in a way that felt comforting. He threw himself back into his routine, not out of distraction, but out of a genuine desire to keep moving forward. His work, his hobbies, his walks, everything took on new meaning. For the first time in a long time, he was living for himself, and he could feel the difference. His days were no longer filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. The weight of the past no longer hung over him. It wasn't that he had forgotten her, it was that he had finally understood that his happiness didn't rely on someone else. He had learned how to be content with himself, and that had given him the freedom to truly live again. He spent more time with friends, reconnecting with people he hadn't spoken to in months. He traveled to places he had always wanted to visit, but had never found the time for. He discovered new things about himself, things he had buried under the weight of his past relationship. He realized he had been so focused on pleasing others that he had forgotten to nurture his own passions and desires. One afternoon, as he sat at a cafe sipping his coffee, he found himself smiling without any particular reason. It was a small moment, one of those simple pleasures that he had long overlooked. He was happy, not because of anything external, but simply because he had found peace within himself. He wasn't waiting for something or someone to fill the void anymore. The void was gone. But it wasn't just the small pleasures of life that had changed. He had also begun to understand his own worth in a way that he never had before. He was no longer seeking validation from anyone, not from a partner, not from his job, not from anyone but himself. He was enough. And that realization had made all the difference. As time passed, he started to see his life in a new light. The future no longer felt like an uncertain path filled with fear and doubt. It felt like a journey of possibilities. There were still challenges, of course. He still had moments when he missed her, when he wondered what could have been. But those moments were fleeting now, replaced by a sense of empowerment. He was no longer tied to the past. He was free to build the future he wanted. And then, one evening, he got a call. It was from her. His heart skipped a beat, but this time, it wasn't a surge of panic or longing. It was more like a moment of curiosity. He had moved on, but he hadn't completely shut the door. He answered the phone, not knowing what to expect, but ready for whatever came next. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice quieter than before. "I understand why you made your choice. I can't say I wasn't hoping for a different outcome, but I get it now. You've changed, and so have I. I just wanted to tell you that. I'm proud of you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. There was no apology this time, no regret. Just a quiet recognition that they had both moved on, in different ways. She had found her own path, and so had he. The pain of the past was still there, but it was no longer an open wound. It had healed into something more like a scar, something that was part of him, but no longer defined him. "I'm proud of you too," he replied, his voice steady. "And I wish you nothing but the best." They said goodbye, and as he hung up the phone, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The chapter with her had truly closed. He had no anger, no resentment. Just a quiet acceptance that life had unfolded exactly the way it was meant to. For the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. He didn't need someone to complete him. He had already found everything he needed within himself. And now, the world was full of new possibilities, new experiences, and new chances for growth. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. Life had a way of testing the progress he had made, even when he thought he was in control. It had been several months since his decision to move forward, and he had settled into a new rhythm. He was happier, more confident, and had made peace with the past. But life wasn't done with him yet. The universe, it seemed, had one more lesson to teach him. It all began with a phone call from work. The company he worked for had undergone some changes, and they needed someone to step into a higher role, a more demanding position that came with more responsibility, and more stress. At first, he wasn't sure what to think. He had been comfortable where he was, doing his job without too much pressure. But this was an opportunity to prove himself, to take on something bigger. He was hesitant, not because he lacked confidence, but because he had learned the hard way that chasing success for the wrong reasons could lead to burnout, disappointment, and emptiness. He had seen how it had consumed him in the past, how he had sacrificed everything, including his happiness, to prove his worth through achievements and status. But as he thought about it, something shifted. He realized that this new challenge wasn't about proving anything to anyone else, it was about testing himself. It was about seeing how far he had truly come in his personal growth. Could he handle the pressure without losing sight of who he had become? Could he navigate this new responsibility without slipping back into the old habits of chasing approval? The decision wasn't easy. He could feel the pull of his old self, the part of him that wanted to dive headfirst into the challenge without thinking about the consequences. But he had learned to slow down, to take a step back, and really evaluate his choices. This time, he knew that success wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about maintaining balance, staying grounded, and keeping his peace. He took a deep breath and accepted the position. But he made a promise to himself, this time, he would do things differently. He would set boundaries. He would take breaks. He would prioritize his mental health. He wasn't going to lose himself in the pursuit of success, and he wasn't going to let the pressure consume him. The first few weeks were a whirlwind. The new role came with long hours, high expectations, and difficult decisions. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed, when the stress threatened to pull him under. There were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had made the right choice. But then, he remembered the lessons he had learned in the past year. He remembered how far he had come, how much he had changed. He remembered that his happiness wasn't tied to the success he achieved, it was tied to how he chose to live, how he responded to the challenges that life threw at him. He could handle this. He had to believe that. Slowly, he began to find his footing. He learned to delegate, to trust his team, to take breaks when needed. He started to find moments of peace amidst the chaos. It wasn't easy, and there were still tough days, but he was no longer consumed by the need to prove himself. He was doing the work because he enjoyed the challenge, not because he was seeking validation. And through it all, he realized something important: the challenge wasn't just about the role he had taken on at work. It was about life itself. Every day was a test, a chance to see how far he had come, to see if he had truly internalized the lessons of growth, balance, and self-respect. The world would continue to throw obstacles his way, but now he faced them with a newfound confidence. He knew that whatever came next, he was ready. He had learned to be resilient, to stay true to himself, and to find strength in the most difficult moments. And for the first time, he understood that growth wasn't just about moving forward, it was about how you faced the challenges along the way. As the months passed, the pressure from his new role began to ease. He had learned to manage the demands, to keep the work-life balance in check, and to protect his mental health. His success wasn't measured by the number of hours he worked or the titles he held. It was measured by the peace he had found within himself and the relationships he had nurtured along the way. He had built a life that reflected who he truly was, not who he thought he needed to be. And as time went on, he felt a sense of fulfillment that was deeper than anything he had ever experienced before. The material success and the external recognition no longer mattered in the same way. What mattered now was that he had become the person he had always wanted to be, not just for others, but for himself. One evening, as he walked through the park, he found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The familiar path, the same one where he had once stood in heartache and confusion, now felt like a symbol of his journey. It was a reminder of all the struggles, the heartbreak, the lessons, and the growth that had led him to this point. He thought about the time when he had felt lost, when he had believed that his worth was tied to what others thought of him, to his success, and to the love of someone who had walked away. He had been devastated then, unsure of how he would move forward. But now, standing in the same park, he realized that everything had happened for a reason. The pain, the heartache, the lessons, it had all shaped him into the person he was today. And as he looked around, he realized something else too: he wasn't alone anymore. Not because he had found someone to love him, but because he had learned to love himself. He had discovered that true happiness wasn't found in the approval of others or in the validation of success. It was found in the quiet moments of self-acceptance, in the ability to stand tall, no matter what life threw at him. The world had taught him many lessons along the way, but perhaps the most important one was this: growth is never linear. There are always setbacks, always challenges, always moments of doubt. But in the end, it's how we respond to those challenges, how we learn and adapt, that defines us. And he had learned to embrace that. The decision he had made to move forward, to prioritize his own growth and well-being, had been the right one. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments of temptation to look back, but in the end, he had built a life that was truly his own. A life filled with peace, purpose, and a deep sense of self-worth. And now, as he stood there, in the same park where it all began, he understood that this wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of a whole new story. A story that wasn't defined by the past, but by the person he had become. With a final deep breath, he smiled, ready for whatever the future held.